In this lecture, you are going to learn about the rise of the city, immigrant labor, the family economy, life in the city, and the resistance against immigration. Life in the city begins to change dramatically towards the end of the 19th century. New inventions make for a new lifestyle. We will see changes in transportation. Instead of horses and carriages, people will begin to use trolley cars and subways. Structural steel made possible enormous advances in building, and skyscrapers began to dominate the imagination and the urban landscape. Cities became more beautiful, and the creation of urban public parks to complement the new buildings that quickly filled city lots. Bridges also became architectural masterpieces. The Brooklyn Bridge will be built during this time period and will be a symbol of American ingenuity and might. But who built all the bridges, roads, and skyscrapers? Well, a lot of it was built on the backs of immigrant labor. In the waning decades of the 19th century, the movement from rural areas to urban industrial centers attracted millions of immigrants to American shores. Capitalistic development in the late 1800s shattered traditional patterns of economic activity in the rural areas. As old patterns broke down, rural areas exported, along with raw materials, new recruits for the industrial labor force. Beginning in the 1870s, railroad expansion and low steamship fares gave the world's people a newfound mobility, enabling industrialists to draw on the global population for cheap labor. In the late 19th century, large-scale immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe into the United States contributed to the growth of cities and changes in American demographics. The largest number of immigrants to the United States came from the British Isles and German-speaking lands, and later on, we will see an increase in immigration from Eastern Europe. Would-be immigrants eager for information about the United States relied on letters from friends and relatives, advertisements, and word of mouth, sources that were not always dependable or truthful. Most new immigrants remain in cities, but not all newcomers came to stay. Many young men worked for a year or a season and then returned to their homelands. Jews escapaded violent persecutions in Eastern Europe usually came with their families and they came to stay. The influx of immigrants was such that an immigration facility opened in 1892 in New York Harbor to process new immigrants coming into New York City. In the late 19th century, some 75% of European immigrants to America came through New York. The influx of immigrants, alongside a large movement of Americans from the countryside to the city, helped propel the rapid growth of cities like New York, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. By 1890, immigrants and their children accounted for roughly 60% of the population in most large northern cities, and sometimes as high as 80 or 90%. However, as different groups began to arrive, social and racial segregation emerged in cities. African Americans typically experienced the greatest residential segregation, but every large city had its ethnic enclaves. Like Little Italy, Chinatown, Germantown, etc. These ethnic enclaves also serve as a separation between the rich and the poor. Photojournalist Jacob Riis documented in his book How the Other Half Lives in 1890 the poverty, crowding, dirt, and disease that constituted the daily reality of New York City's immigrant poor. Riis' middle-class readers shivered at the revelations about the poor, but they also worried about the excess of the wealthy. The excess of the Gilded Age newly minted millionaires became especially alarming when coupled with disdain for the general welfare of ordinary people. As mentioned earlier, industrial capitalism was the most important factor that drove immigrants to the United States between 1880 and 1920. Immigrant workers labor in large industrial complexes, producing goods such as steel, textiles, and food products, replacing smaller and more local workshops. Common laborers who stood at the bottom of the country's economic ladder and generally came from the most recent immigrant groups formed the backbone of the American labor force. At the opposite end of the labor hierarchy stood skilled craftsmen, but even for skilled workers, most industry and manufacturing in the 19th century remained seasonal. Few workers could count on year-round pay. Moreover, industrialization created a shift in craftsmanship. For example, you may remember from your readings how Frederick Winslow Taylor introduces the concept of the manager, a middle boss between the owner and the workers to oversee the workers. As a consequence, work becomes less personal, no longer about communication with others. In fact, scientific management encourages as little contact as possible among workers and between workers and the bosses and the owner. The scientific nature of the concept is key. Work will become objective, more regularized, more systematic. The concept of time and its relationship to work changes drastically. Now the worker has set working hours, must clock in and clock out. Hours needed to complete a certain phase of the project or a small quantity no longer apply. Before industrialization, if a worker was finished by 2, he had finished for the day. Now guided by the time clock, efficiency and speed are stressed rather than pride and quality of work. Each person learned one tiny part of the process instead of learning the whole trade. Workers then become part of an assembly line instead of being able to take pride in the finished product.
This also leads to loss of skill, loss of pride in work, and demoralization. As the worker becomes part of the machinery. Thus, working conditions are difficult. The average work week was 59 hours. As late as the 1920s, many steel workers were working an 84-hour work week. Factories also had poor health and safety conditions. In 1913, there were around 25,000 factory fatalities that year. Working for the meatpacking industry was famously horrendous. Coal and copper mines were extremely dangerous as well. Average hourly wage in manufacturing was 21.6 cents, and average annual earnings were $490. As a consequence of these changes in the business and the workplace, the rich were becoming very rich indeed. Moreover, as mechanization transformed the garment industry with the introduction of the foot pedal sewing machine and mechanical clothing cutting knives, independent tailors were replaced with sweatshop workers hired by contractors to sew pieces into clothing. Sweatshop workers will get paid meager wages for each garment made. So in order to be able to make enough money to sustain themselves, sweatshop workers will often require the work of the whole family to contribute. In fact, many working-class families, whether native-born or immigrant, live in or near poverty. Their economic survival depended on the contributions of all family members, regardless of sex or age. The paid and unpaid work of women and children proved essential for family survival and economic advancement. In the late 19th century, the number of women workers rose sharply. Mechanization transformed the textile mills and the garment industry, where most workers were young, unmarried women who worked long, hard hours. Black women, married and unmarried, worked for wages in much greater numbers. Discriminated against the marketplace, women earned less than men and were largely ignored by labor unions. Moreover, by the early 1900s, as many as 4 million children between the ages of 10 and 15 toiled long hours at low pay. Children, both boys and girls, also work in a variety of jobs as bootlegs and newsboys, and in mills and factories. Perhaps one of the most back-breaking jobs for children was working in the mines. Breaker boys, as they were called, were usually between the ages of 8 and 12 years old. For 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, breaker boys would sit on wooden seats, perch over the chutes and conveyor belts, picking slate and other impurities out of the coal. Child labor increased decade by decade, and the percentage of children under the age 15 who were engaged in paid labor did not drop until after World War I. Workplace conditions were particularly harsh for these new sources of labor, and they were often exploited by the managers and bosses. Ethnic diversity and racism play a role in dividing skilled workers from the unskilled. Throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, members of the educated elite, as well as workers, viewed ethnic and even religious differences as racial characteristics. Many Americans saw the new immigrants as uneducated and backward. And blue-blooded Yankees such as Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts formed an unlikely alliance with leaders of organized labor, who fear that immigrants will drive down wages, to press for immigration restriction. As a consequence of this ideology in the 1840s, the derogatory discourse became prevalent in the U.S. Then something that contemporaries began to call Irishism began to appear in newspapers and magazines. Under this representation, the Irish man was represented as low-browed, brutish, and even simian in popular culture. On the West Coast, the Asian population grew until racism and the portrayal of Chinese immigrants as deviants, criminals, and as people who were taking jobs away from Americans began the movement that will eventually lead to the Chinese Exclusion Act. In the spring of 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by Congress and signed by President Chester A. Arthur. The act provided an absolute 10-year moratorium on Chinese labor immigration. For the first time, federal law prescribed entry of an ethnic working group on the premise that it endangered the good order of certain localities. The Chinese are the only national group to be singled out by name for a denial of admission to the country in the Chinese Exclusion Act. The act will serve as a blueprint for American immigration policy to come. The Chinese Exclusion Act slowed Chinese immigration to a trickle. Those who stayed were shut out of many fields of employment. Nevertheless, they created their own societies and support groups, and many Chinese immigrants founded their own restaurants, laundries, and other small businesses. Others, like these cannery workers in Astoria, Oregon, took on some of the most grueling and lowest paid work in the American economy. During the Gilded Age, industry pulled ever more Americans into cities. Soon, the United States had more large cities than any country in the world. The 1920 U.S. Census revealed that for the first time, a majority of Americans live in urban centers. Much of that urban growth came from the millions of immigrants pouring into the nation. Between 1870 and 1920, over 25 million immigrants arrived in the United States. The specific reasons that immigrants left their particular countries and the reasons they came to the United States varied, but one thing is for sure, they left a lasting impact in U.S. history. That is all for now. To learn more, please watch the next video lecture.